Nine chords are one of my favorite chord extensions. This tutorial will get you up to speed with playing these type of chords and hopefully show you some interesting but also very practical techniques that come from using these chords in your music. So if you haven't already, I highly suggest you go and check out a previous video I made on playing the 2-5-1 chord progression, which is so common in sort of jazzy or piano styles, and also really helpful for learning how to play chord extensions. The 9 chord is referring to a type of chord extension. So if we take a look at, for instance, the C major scale, you start to understand where intervals come from and how chords are constructed. So in other words, a simple triad has 3 notes, the root, the third, the fifth. When we extend it, we add on the next extension interval, which would be typically a 7th. And then maybe you add on another interval after that, and there's the 9th. So in other words, a 9 chord, not an add 9 chord, but something like a D minor 9, or a C major 9, or an A minor 9. These are chords that are referring to the intervals being the root, the third, the fifth, the 7th, and the 9th. Now let's start by just taking the left hand and playing a D minor triad, like that. Use whatever fingers feel most comfortable to you, but the main point of it being that you want to use or keep the left hand thumb free. So in this case, I'm using my pinky, middle, and index, because what we're going to do is add the thumb on to the C, making a D minor 7 chord. And this is from a previous video. We talked about doing this playing 4-note chords with the left hand in that previous video. Go check that out if you haven't. But we're doing this so we can set up adding on the 9, which is going to be the E. And just like that, we have those intervals that we talked about, the root, the minor third, the perfect fifth, the minor 7th, and the major 9. So here I have my left hand playing these 4 notes, and my right hand comes in to play the E. Now, of course, we're sticking to the C major scale, so we know that these constructions are all going to be on the white keys. But what you'll find in that previous video I've been talking about is also the idea of constructing different voicings for these chords. So a 2-5-1 progression would be D minor to G major to C major. Or in 7th chords, that would be D minor 7, G dominant 7, C major 7. So now what we're going to do is take that same exact philosophy and apply it to the 9 chords, but using a kind of voice leading. So previously we had learned D minor 7 can easily voice lead to a G dominant 7 using this voicing, where the G, the root note, is not on the bottom, instead it's D. This would also be called an inversion by some people. And then C major 7 is very easy to transition to as well. So that was in 7th chords though. When I bring in my right hand, I can now add that in. So my right hand plays the E. I'm just using my index finger because that's kind of natural to do for me. It's nice you can kind of glide into that chord. Now you're going to do the same exact thing with the left hand switching to that voicing. And we're just going to take the right hand and move down to D. Now technically this is still a G dominant 7 chord. There's no 9 represented here, but you're going to learn later in this video how to play some other very interesting variations of this technique. But for now we're using that typical left hand voicing for the G dominant 7. And the right hand just moves down a whole step to D, and it's very easy to go to the C major 9 chord because the only thing that's actually going to move is your left hand to the C major 7 shape. And the D that you're staying on with the right hand is representing the 9 in the context of that chord, so that becomes C major 9. And something you see me doing there is actually resolving the D or the 9 to the 1, which is C, right? Okay, so let's just try a simple variation of the technique that we've already learned. Maybe do something with the right hand that's a little more interesting, but also still very musical sounding. So something I actually do is I don't move the right hand at all. It stays on E. Now the chord symbols on the bottom are a little bit inaccurate with this particular case, but what I would actually call this is a G dominant 13 chord, because in this case the E, by being placed over a G dominant 7 chord, is actually the major 6th, or an octave up would be the major 13th of the G dominant chord. So by just keeping that tone there, you're actually playing a 13th chord, which is pretty cool if you haven't heard of that. And then we go down to D over the C major chord to play a C major 9. But what if you wanted to play a G dominant 9 over that chord, just like the other two chords? If we started off here, and now we want to go to a G dominant 9 chord, let's do what we did before, where the right hand is going to move to D, but instead of moving to that typical shape with the left hand, we're going to add on the 9, which is actually represented right here in the A, because G is the 1, A is the 2, or up an octave would be 9. But also by reinforcing that D on top, it really makes it sound like a dominant 9 chord, a G dominant 9. So there you have that G dominant 9 chord. D minor 9, G dominant 9, and C major 9. It's very typical to see a 2-5-1 progression also be tagged at the end with the 6th chord, or the A minor 9. All we actually have to do is now move this shape down 2 keys to there. So you get this very nice gentle resolution of the chord progression to that 6th chord, the A minor 9. So again, like let's say for instance you want to take this technique, this chord progression, and play it in a more ornate style. So take your left hand, play the D minor 7 shape that you've learned with your right hand, and instead of using your index finger, let's just use the thumb on the right hand to play the E. Now what this is going to do is set up our right hand to play more than one interval, and this is where we're going to start to get a more stacked kind of ornate sound. This voicing, for instance, looks kind of complicated, but it's really not. Remember, this is all that's happening in the left hand. The right hand is playing the 9th, and then notice how I'm doubling up the F, which you can see with the index finger of my right hand. That's the minor 3rd of the D minor chord. So I'm doubling up my minor 3rd, which is a very important interval, and I'm also doubling up the C's. So the pinky of my right hand is reaching for that C. That's the 7th, the minor 7th of the D minor 7 chord, or D minor 9 now. So I'm doubling up my 3rd and 7th, which is giving me a very strong, kind of beautiful voicing. And you have this nice beautiful tension because there's a half step between those two notes right in the middle of the chord. So that creates a very lush sound. It's also the basis of how you can do some really interesting things we'll get into in just a second. But if you want to go to the G dominant 7 chord, just use the same thing you've learned in the left hand with this shape. And in the right hand, you're going from playing this thumb, index, pinky. Keep the index finger planted, and you're just going to move your pinky down to B. And just like that, you've transitioned really easily. It might take a little bit of practice to get used to doing this kind of motion where the right hand's playing more than one note, but just give it some time. And the cool thing is when you resolve to C major 9, it has the same setup available to do the same thing you did with the D minor 9. So the same thing in the left hand and the same setup in the right hand. Really nice kind of lush voicing that you can use. And when I want to repeat what I've played in that progression, just take everything and move it up a key, and you're right back to where you started. think about it. What's happening in that right hand? We have the E, the F, and the C, right? Well, let's take the F off and just go with the ninth, which we're concerned with, obviously. In this video, we're talking about 9 chords, right? And we'll keep the C at the top. So we've added on this little pair of notes. I call this an interval. And this is actually a minor sixth. You can see it there on the screen there. A lot of times when you're trying to create more interesting movement in your melodic lines, let's say that you're playing with your right hand, you'll use parallel sixths, parallel thirds, or maybe the octave equivalent of that, which is parallel 13ths or parallel tenths. Basically, you create this sort of harmonization effect. So I'm just playing the C major scale in sixths. And you can easily think of it as like, 4 keys in the middle, right? So if you're looking down at your hand, you could just think, oh, there's 4 keys there. And you just kind of move up and down. I take the chords in the left hand, doing the same thing we've been doing. But now let's just use the right hand to create melody.